Good morning. We welcome you all from NKP SIMS and LMH Nagpur. Today, on behalf of MSBRI, MCR and NKP SIMS Nagpur, we have organized this workshop on neck ultrasound, and we will be covering various aspects of neck ultrasound like thyroid, salivary glands, lymph nodes, artificial intelligence in thyroid ultrasound. First of all, let me thank MSBRI and Maharashtra College of Radiology along with the NKP SIMS management for allowing us to organize this webinar series. Last year we had done 5 workshops on different topics in ultrasound and color Doppler, and this year also we have planned this series of webinars. We also thank Samsung for sponsoring the audiovisual transmission of this event to all of you. These webinars are meant for students as well as young radiologists who are taking up who have taken up radiology as career, and we try to include maximum practical tips and techniques into our demonstrations and lectures. So with this we will start today's session. With me is Dr. Sandeep Dhote. He is a senior faculty in the department, and we together will conduct today's workshop. So first we will start with demonstration of normal neck ultrasound anatomy. It will be done by Dr. Sandeep Dhote. Over to Dr. Sandeep.
Thank you, Dr. Omkar sir. A very good morning to all of you. At the outset, let me thank VITRAD, MSBRI and MICR for giving me this opportunity for presenting the normal neck ultrasound demonstration. So, the ultrasound of the neck, as we all know, is done with the help of a high frequency linear array transducer. The usefulness of linear array transducer is that apart from being high frequency, it also has got a very wide narrow field of view. Very wide near field of view, I am sorry. So the patient lies supine with the neck extended. The neck is basically divided into 2 parts, the suprahyoid portion and the infrahyoid portion. While doing neck ultrasound, from the ultrasound perspective examination of the neck, we divide the neck into 8 spaces. The first thing, we start from submental region, which houses the sublingual space. Then we go to the submandibular space. Then next is the parotid space. Then we come down to the upper cervical, mid cervical and lower cervical region. Then we go to the posterior triangle, supraclavicular fossa and posterior triangle, and in the end we come in the midline. So this sequential examination of the neck ensures that each and every part of the neck is examined and the lesions are not missed. For most of the lesions in the neck are amenable to accurate diagnosis depending on their location. So it is important to know the location of the lesion. So I am now putting my probe transversely in the submental space. The submental space, submental triangle, has its apex at symphysis menti and its base is formed by the hyoid bone. Its floor is formed by the mylohyoid muscle, and on its 2 sides are formed by the anterior belly of digastric muscle. So if I keep the probe transversely in the submental space, this is the anatomy that I am going to see. So first we see this thin strip of hypoechoic muscle, that is the platysma muscle. It should not be confused with the subcutaneous fat. On either side we have anterior belly of digastric, then this U-shaped muscle going from right to left is the mylohyoid muscle, which forms the floor of the mouth. This muscle in the center is the geniohyoid muscle. Then on either side we have genioglossus, and laterally on either side we see the sublingual salivary gland. This has got classical salivary gland signature. So this is the anatomy in this particular region. The contents of this submental space on either side is the lingual artery, lingual vein, lingual nerve, along with the cranial nerve 9th and 12th. We won't be able to see the nerves. This is also the region where the duct of the submandibular gland would terminate, and so therefore it is necessary, when a requisition comes for a calculus of the submandibular gland, then it is necessary that we first put the probe in the sublingual space rather than directly rushing to the submandibular space. The space, sublingual space, communicates with the contralateral space and also with the submandibular space, and posteriorly with the parapharyngeal space. So the examination of sublingual space is not complete without examining the submandibular space because of the communication. So if we want to revise the anatomy, I'll just freeze the image, and then we can once again go through the anatomy and revise it. So this is the anterior belly of digastric on the right side. This is the anterior belly of digastric on the left side. Mylohyoid muscle is coming over here. The center one is the geniohyoid muscle. On either side we have got genioglossus. This is the sublingual gland. So the muscle, remembering the muscles is very important, because the muscles act as landmark. They tell us where our probe is, and hence they tell us where the lesion is. So this is the transverse scan of the axial scan, or transverse scan of the submental space. If I keep the probe longitudinal in this space, थोड़ा मंडी ऐसा करना, ऐसा करना. If I keep the probe longitudinal in this space, then we find the symphysis menti at the top, then genioglossus, geniohyoid, going right up to the patient is too thin, so I am not able to get the insertion of geniohyoid on the hyoid. थोड़ा ऐसा कर लेना. So here I am able to get the hyoid bone. Here is the hyoid bone, and this is the insertion of the geniohyoid muscle. So this completes the inspection of the submental triangle, which houses the sublingual space. Now the pathologies that we can encounter in this triangle are ranula, lymph nodes, then we can have calculus of the submandibular gland duct. We can also have malignancies of the base of the tongue, which will distort the anatomy. In fact, distortion of the anatomy may be the first sign that some pathology is there. So we have to keep the normal anatomy in mind, keeping in mind also that a calculus in this space is actually the calculus of the submandibular gland duct, and we have to go back and look at the submandibular gland also. Then we move on to the submandibular region. I just turn the head of the patient to one side, then just keeping the probe transversely in the submandibular region, I get to see the submandibular gland. There is always a lymph node in this area, and then we see that the submandibular gland is basically has got two lobes, a superficial lobe which is larger and which is traversed by the facial vein, and a smaller deep lobe which runs between the mylohyoid muscle and the hyoglossus muscle. The mandibular gland is frequently abutting the apex of the parotid gland, superficial lobe of the parotid gland, like we see here. So, like I said, we have a deep lobe of the submandibular gland which runs between the mylohyoid muscle and the hyoglossus muscle, and it is very important to have a look at this deep lobe because the duct of the submandibular gland exists from this space and from this deep lobe, and when it exists, it does so in the form of a shape of a hockey stick. It comes like this and goes medially into the sublingual region. So the calculi usually they lodge before the exit when there is a bend, and then between the two muscles, and thirdly where the duct terminates. So these are the three fixed points where the calculi of the submandibular gland they lodge, and it is very important to look at the this site. The submandibular gland is generally less echogenic as compared to that of the parotid gland, because parotid gland has fat, and so it is more echogenic as compared to the submandibular gland. We have the facial vein traversing the submandibular gland. So if for example a lesion is here, then it is very difficult to say whether the lesion arises from the submandibular gland or from the parotid gland. One clue to the origin of the lesion could be the displacement of the facial vein. If the facial vein is displaced laterally, then it can point to the diagnosis that the lesion is arising from the submandibular gland. If the facial vein is displaced medially, it might suggest that the lesion is arising from the parotid gland. Of course, nowadays coronal MR would be a better option, but this is just a guide. Submandibular gland, submandibular space continues downwards into the upper cervical space. But we go now to the parotid space. The parotid space lies between the external auditory canal and the tip of the mastoid bone, and inferiorly up to the ramus of the mandible. The contents of this space are the parotid gland, the parotid duct, which runs along the masseter to pierce the baxillary and open into the upper second molar. This is the axial section I am taking at the level of the ramus of the mandible. So we can see the parotid gland here, the masseter muscle. This is the ramus of the mandible. Parotid gland is more attenuating, therefore the deeper portions may not be seen properly, but the important landmarks to see on this are the retromandibular vein and the external carotid artery. The retromandibular vein lies immediately behind the ramus of the mandible. Here. So if I make the probe longitudinally, I see the retromandibular vein and the external carotid artery. So the top one is the retromandibular vein and the lower one is the external carotid artery. As I go longitudinally downwards, I see that the retromandibular vein and the external carotid artery is separated by a muscle. So this muscle is the posterior belly of the digastric along with the stylohyoid muscle. This anatomy can be seen on the transverse section as well. So here we see the retromandibular vein, the external carotid artery and the posterior belly of the digastric. Knowing where the posterior belly of digastric is important because it helps to differentiate us the level of the lymph node. Anything above the posterior belly of digastric is the parotid lymph node, whereas below it is the jugulo-digastric node. So we know that the extracranial facial nerve comes from the traverses through the parotid gland and divides it. A useful mnemonic to remember is that the retromandibular vein is lateral to the carotid artery and the facial nerve is lateral to the retromandibular vein. So the surgical plane would lie somewhere here where the facial nerve would be. We also find that the parotid gland has lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are not present within the submandibular gland. Lymphoid tissue is present in both submandibular as well as the parotid gland, but lymph nodes are found only within the parotid gland. The reason for that is the submandibular gland encapsulates very early in embryologic life before the lymph nodes have been formed, whereas the parotid gland it encapsulates later in embryologic life after the formation of lymph nodes. So some of the lymph nodes are within the parotid gland. This is also the reason that why the Warthin's tumor is found exclusively in the parotid gland and never in the submandibular gland. It is because of the rest of the salivary gland, heterotropic rest of salivary gland tissue within the lymph node. Just as the gland engulfs the node also engulfs some of the salivary tissue, and that leads to Warthin's tumor. So here is the parotid space. As we know, this is the masseter muscle, the duct of the parotid gland. It travels anterior to the masseter muscle. It is also important not to mistake the lesions of the masseter muscle from that of the parotid gland. Now, as from here we go down, and go down below the posterior belly of digastric, and then we see the upper cervical region. The upper cervical region contains the internal jugular vein, the carotid arteries, bifurcation of carotid, the vagus nerve, the jugulo-digastric lymph node. So as I come down, I see this is the carotid bifurcation here. Carotid bifurcation is here. The internal jugular vein is just to laterally and slightly anterior to it. And there I also find the jugulo-digastric node, which lies just anterior to the internal jugular vein. So this region showing the bifurcation of the carotids, the internal jugular vein and the jugular digastric node, is the classic site for the occurrence of second branchial cleft cyst. In a pediatric patient, a cystic lesion occurring at this site, which is below the submandibular sternocleidomastoid muscle, anterior margin of sternocleidomastoid muscle, behind the submandibular gland and anterior to the carotid bifurcation. This is the classical site for the appearance of second branchial cleft cyst. But we should not forget that here there is jugular digastric node, and this can also become necrotic and big and appear cystic. And so in an adult we should also keep in mind a possibility of a necrotic lymph node, most commonly from the papillary carcinoma of the thyroid. So if in doubt, if it shows features of malignancy, then we can always go for an FNAC. So this is the classic site for that. Now as we go down in the mid cervical region, the contents of the cervical region are the same, mostly the jugular vein, carotid artery, vagus nerve and the lymph node. So the differential diagnosis of the lesions that occur in the cervical space is also narrow, and it is easy to reach at a diagnosis. So here we see that the vagus nerve is lies between the carotid artery, common carotid, and the jugular vein. So supposing if a vagus nerve schwannoma occurs at this side, what it will do is it will cause further separation of the internal jugular vein and the carotid artery. Now how do we differentiate that from a sympathetic schwannoma? A sympathetic schwannoma will arise from this side and it will cause anterior displacement of both the common carotid as well as the internal jugular vein. It will not cause separation. So this is how we distinguish a vagus schwannoma from that of a sympathetic schwannoma. Furthermore, at the bifurcation we can get a carotid body tumor which will cause a further displacement of the external and the internal carotid arteries, and they would be far off from each other. As we go down, we trace the internal jugular vein going down at a point. The internal jugular vein is crossed by the inferior belly of the omohyoid. This is the inferior belly of the omohyoid. This thin is the internal jugular vein. So this is the lower margin of the middle cervical region. Inferior belly of omohyoid helps us to know that this level is the level at which the lower margin of the cricoid cartilage will be. Similarly, the carotid artery bifurcation, it tells us the level of the hyoid bones. It corresponds to the level of the hyoid bone. This is the carotid artery bifurcation. It corresponds to the level of the hyoid bone. As we go down, we trace the internal jugular vein, and when the internal jugular vein is crossed by the inferior belly of omohyoid, this point corresponds to the lower margin of the cricoid, and here the middle cervical region ends and the lower cervical region starts. In the lower cervical region, the internal jugular vein joins the subclavian veins to form the brachiocephalic vein. Now we now move on to the supraclavicular fossa and the posterior triangle of the neck. The posterior triangle of the neck is formed by the posterior margin of the sternocleidomastoid muscle here, then the anterior margin of the trapezius, and all the muscles lying in between them, they form the floor. The base of the posterior triangle is formed by the clavicle. Now this inferior belly of omohyoid divides this posterior triangle into a superior portion and an inferior portion. The superior triangle is called the occipital triangle and the inferior triangle is called the supraclavicular triangle. And the anatomy in this particular triangle is only muscles and muscles. So if I go laterally, I first encounter the scalene muscle, scalenus anterior and scalenus medius. If I go further laterally, I see the levator scapulae muscle, and then further laterally the trapezius muscle will come into picture. So between the scalene muscles, I can see the brachial plexus. So if a brachial plexus schwannoma is there, we can trace these nerve roots to the spinal canal. Like I am just turning my probe longitudinally here, and here I am seeing the nerve roots exiting from the spinal canal. So the majority of the anatomy in this triangle is muscles. There is only a thin strip of fat, and through this fat the accessory nerve and the accessory nodes are present. Then we come to the midline of the neck. In the midline, we see the larynx, and then as we come down, we see the thyroid gland. There are two strap muscles here, the sternohyoid and sternothyroid. This one is the sternohyoid and the sternothyroid is here. So what we have to do is we have to trace this area, which is called the central compartment between the strap muscles, down to the sternum. This is important because the central compartment, which is the area between the strap muscles, may be the site of residual disease or a persistent disease. Now we come to the examination of the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland has got two lateral lobes and a connecting thin isthmus. Look at the normal echogenicity of the thyroid gland and its sharp margin, which is clearly visible. So each lobe must be scanned in transverse plane, starting from the upper pole going down to the middle and then the lower pole, and also in a longitudinal plane. And we have to measure the lobes of the thyroid. The measurements in the longitudinal plane are taken to measure the length and then the depth. Maximum depth is to be taken. The AP dimension is a very reliable index for the determination of enlargement of the thyroid lobe or the thyroid gland, and if more than 2 cm, it can be reliably concluded that the thyroid gland is enlarged. And the length of the lobe of the thyroid depends upon the patient's stature. In thin and long patients, it can go up to 7 to 8 cm, whereas in obese it is up to 5 cm. But I usually take AP as the reliable indicator for thyroid enlargement. The third dimension that we take is the transverse dimension, maximum transverse dimension. Some people also take volume of the thyroid gland. This volume helps us to know how much is the dose of iodine 131 that can be required, and also for the follow-up of the treated patients. Then there is called as Zucker-Candles tubercle. It is seen here. Zucker-Candles tubercle is seen in up to 60% of the thyroid lobes. it is the posterior extension of the lateral lobes of thyroid. If you see here, there is just a lip of a thyroid tissue which is coming posterior, and it is connected with the main thyroid gland with the thyroid tissue. This is the Zucker-Kandel's tubercle. The importance of Zucker-Kandel tubercle is that while doing total thyroidectomy, it is to be removed. Then it covers the recurrent laryngeal nerve. It covers the recurrent laryngeal nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerve lies medial to it in the tracheoesophageal groove if the Zucker-Kandel's tubercle is enlarged, and in 93% of the cases, whereas it lies lateral to it in only 6% of the cases. So this is the Zucker-Kandel's tubercle. It is more common on the right side, seen in up to 70% of the cases, whereas it is seen in up to 50% of the cases on the left side. It is the number one false positive for the superior parathyroid gland. So that must be kept in mind. We don't have to report it as superior parathyroid gland adenoma. So on the left side again we see the esophagus, which has got typical gut signature, and it can also show peristalsis on if the patient is asked to swallow. We see the thyroid gland and we see the carotid artery. So this particular location can be the site of normal thymic tissue. This can be the location of a normal thymic tissue, this particular area, and since the normal thymic tissue can be present, that thymic tissue can also develop a cyst, and this thymic cyst that occurs here can be misdiagnosed as a necrotic lymph node, and so it is diagnosed only by its location between the thyroid left lobe of thyroid, common carotid artery, and anterior to the esophagus. We can trace the cervical esophagus. Now, while examining the neck, it is very important that we do not forget about the internal jugular vein. Internal jugular vein has to be seen just like we see for the DVT in lower limbs. Its respiratory phasicity should be seen, its collapsibility should be seen, because presence of thrombus in the internal jugular vein might be the first clue that a malignancy is present somewhere in the neck. Now, when there is a thrombus within the internal jugular vein, we have to determine whether that thrombus is a benign thrombus because of the stasis of blood, or it is a malignant thrombus. So the differentiation is done by putting on the color. If the thrombus picks up the color, or that means it shows vascularity, it means that it is a malignant thrombus, whereas a benign thrombus will have no vascularity. So it is important that we look for the internal jugular vein also. Now, coming to the normal lymph nodes of the neck, the normal lymph nodes are generally oval in shape and have a fatty hilum. I'll just try to zoom in on one here. Dr. Prashant is going to elaborate on the characteristics of lymph nodes, both benign and malignant, but suffice here is to tell that the normal lymph node has an oval shape with a fatty hilum. So in short, to differentiate a benign lymph node from a malignant lymph node, we generally look at the 6 characteristics, and these include the shape of the node, whether it is oval or rounded. Here the benign lymph node is oval. Then we look at the fatty hilum. if the fatty hilum is present or not. If it is present, then whether what is the thickness of this fatty hilum. Then we look at the cortex of the lymph node. What is the thickness of the cortex and how is the ecotexture or the architecture of this cortex. We then see the blood vessels going into the hilum and see the vascularity of the node. Try to gauge the vascularity of the node. Generally, either it will not show any vascularity or the vessels will be located only at the hilum, like here. Like in this node, vessel is seen to enter the fatty hilum. Then we also see the extracapsular spread, if it is present or not. So if we try to correlate the appearance of the lymph node with histology, then we will know that the lymph node has an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex contains the lymphoid follicles, whereas the medulla contains the lymphoid sinuses along with connective tissue and blood vessel. So whenever there is an inflammatory node or a node which has been affected because by an inflammatory process, the node is affected diffusely, that is the lymphoid follicles also in hypertrophy as well as the lymphoid sinuses also hypertrophy. So the shape of the node will not change, it will maintain its oval shape. Whereas what happens in case of metastasis or a lymphomatous involvement, the involvement is only in the cortex and it is multifocal. So what happens is the cortex only, lymphoid follicles only grow and the growth is, since the deposits are multifocal, the growth is all around, so the lymph node assumes an irregular rounded shape. Similarly, whenever this metastatic growth is occurring in the lymph node, it will encroach upon the hilum. So the hilum will become thin slit-like, or it may completely disappear. Or if the growth of metastatic growth is occurring eccentrically in a node, this hilum will be shifted to one side. The cortical thickness gives us an idea about the benign nature or the malignant nature, but the concentric thickening of the cortex can be also seen in benign conditions like follicular hyperplasia in 30%, but malignant nodes show this feature more often. In 70% of the cortical thickening, the lymph node is malignant. And we can have calcifications within the cortex, which can be due to granulomatous disease, and these calcifications are chunky calcifications, whereas the papillary and the medullary carcinoma of the thyroid give punctate calcifications within the enlarged lymph node. We can have cystic spaces within the cortex. These can be true cyst or these can be necrotic areas, and true cysts are formed in the papillary metastasis of the papillary carcinoma, and the necrotic areas are seen in squamous cell and the nasopharyngeal carcinomas. Finally, regarding the vascularity, we have seen how the normal vascularity looks. It's only limited to the hilum. If the node is inflammatory, this vascularity increases, but if the node is metastatic, this vascularity spreads to the cortex in an irregular fashion. In cases of lymphomas, particularly the Hodgkin's lymphoma, a short vascular pedicle develops at the hilum, whereas in a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma of low grade, a root-like vascularity is seen, where there is a central large vessel at the hilum and then branches are going into the cortex. So the take-home points for in ultrasound of the neck is: know the muscles, they form important landmarks. Most of the lesions can be diagnosed only by their location and some history, and I think I should stop here. Thank you so much.